stable at 32 at the moment. Anne, would you like to say a bit about yourself?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. It's a great pleasure to be able to give this talk today. Just a little bit about my background. I'm from Lancashire, as you perhaps can gather. Never lost my accent. I'm from the Ribble Valley. I grew up in a farming family, and I went to university in Liverpool to do chemistry first of all. I went there in the mid-60s, which was very exciting, obviously. And I then went to do a further degree in biochemistry. I always wanted to work in a hospital, possibly because I'd been ill as a child. And so I then, after my degree in biochemistry, I went down to Birmingham University to do an MSc in clinical chemistry, which was a 2-year MSc. I then spent my whole career in the National Health Service, specialising in paediatrics, and I specialised in inherited disorders of a metabolic nature and became director of the West Midlands Services for Metabolic Disease and Newborn Screening. Why am I giving this talk? Well, the lab where I was director for 24 years was the laboratory where this lady, Evelyn Hickmans, started her career in clinical chemistry. And she, in fact, founded the laboratory 100 years ago this year. Evelyn had a brother and some stepsisters, but none of them had family, none of them had children. Evelyn never married, never had children. And so there was no family really around her towards the end of her life. And in fact, when I retired from my day job, so to speak, in, 2006, there was a huge amount of material in the department about Evelyn. And I was galvanised really into try and find out more about her and try and put her on the map, because I really felt that she was a very unrecognised person in the field of clinical chemistry. So that's the background to the talk and my link with it. So I hope that gives people enough information. Thank you again. Well, in my book, she's a remarkable lady, or was a remarkable lady, a pioneer ahead of her time. And she established the first biochemistry lab in a children's hospital, certainly in this country and possibly even in the world. This is a photograph of the plaque that is in the hospital, which records her start at the hospital in 1923. What I want to do today is to try and give you an overview of Evelyn's life, her family and early years, her education, her contribution, which was immense to the understanding of children's diseases, and really sum up at the end with what I believe is her legacy of her amazing number of achievements. As I said earlier in the introduction, she had no family, and I think that really is a sadness, because I think no one's really been able to appreciate what she did for children's health. I want to start by orientating you with where Evelyn was born and grew up, and forgive me if you're familiar with this part of the country, but I suspect not everybody is. So we're talking here today. I'm speaking here from Birmingham in the centre of the country, and this is the area of the West Midlands, which is a population of about 5 million people, and the area where Evelyn was born and grew up and started life was in this small Staffordshire village. It was in Staffordshire in those days, not in the West Midlands, called Cosley, which is just south of Wolverhampton. It was a small place in those days. Now it's on the main road between Birmingham and Wolverhampton, and is a very different type of place. It's part of the called Black Country, which you again may be familiar with, so called because of the industry, various industries, in particular the coal mining industry in that area. Evelyn was from a working class family. Her mother was in fact from a farming family, and she was widowed very early with 2 children. So Evelyn had 2 stepsisters, Florence and Alice, and her stepfather, that would have been, as it were, he had died prematurely at the age of 30. He had a grocery business in Coseley, and Mary took on the grocery business with her two daughters. Now, interestingly, she then remarried, and she remarried John's brother, David Hickmans. I had a bit of difficulty with this to start with because they were both called Hickmans, but I subsequently discovered that they were brothers. David Hickmans was from a working class family too. His father and brothers were miners, but he became a school teacher. And I think that may be one of the reasons why Evelyn went into the career that she went into and went to have a significant education. Now, Coseley, this is a map from 1901. This is the High Street, this yellow area here. The grocery business was at the end of the street here. John and David Hickmans were from this other area at the other side here. I'll have to just move, it's in the way. There we are, where the blue arrow is. This is where the 2 brothers lived with their family. And you'll see just from this small map, colliery, coal shafts, colliery, huge industrial area with coal mines. This is the main line in a huge cutting, the main railway line going right through the village. And this here is a huge deep embankment, massive deep embankment with the canal. And of course this was important for the colliery, or the collieries. The school here in Coseley at the time, and this is, I'm sure, where Evelyn went to school at Mount Pleasant, and in fact was where her father was a teacher. So Mary married the other brother, David Hickmans. Evelyn was born in 82, and she had a brother born 2 years later. They were from a very strong Methodist family, and this influenced Evelyn's life throughout. She was a very strong supporter. Evelyn went to school, as I said, in Coseley at this Mount Pleasant school. And then I think it's highly likely, possible, that she went to King Edward's High School in Birmingham. I can't actually prove this from the research that I've done, but there are certain suggestions that this is what happened, and would certainly explain how she ended up being able to subsequently study. King Edward's was one of those schools that promoted women doing science, and it would probably explain how she managed to progress. So she went possibly to King Edward's School. In 1900, the family moved to another village, also in Staffordshire, this time outside the Black Country, into a much more country environment, north of Wolverhampton. And I think the move was undoubtedly because Evelyn's father had changed profession. He had gone from being a school teacher to being a businessman, and had set up a company with a colleague called Mould. Hickmans and Mould Company was formed as a milk pasteurisation company, and they became one of the key providers of pasteurised milk for the Midlands. I don't have a map of Coseley in those days. It's evident from the M54 there running across the top. But for those of you who know the area, Coseley is just south of the M54, north west of Wolverhampton this time. And where they live, where they moved to, is actually a very nice area, a very nice place, quite unlike the Coseley Black Country area. The house where they moved to is no longer there, but this is the area shown with the blue arrow there. And I've just put this on really to show the proximity of the railway station, Console. It's a very nice railway station, if ever you are in the area. And undoubtedly, it was how Evelyn must have got to, first of all, Wolverhampton, where she went, then Birmingham, and then London. This is the main line, which had this little station in Console. So I've tried to imagine what it must have been like for her. Having probably gone to King Edward's High School, she then went to Wolverhampton Technical College. This building shown here is the original Wolverhampton Library, which became the very first science and technical college. And she went to study science at the technical college, probably at evening class, because this is what was happening at the time. And in 1902, when she was 20 years old, she was awarded a special scholarship called the Mander Scholarship, which I will go on to describe in a moment. So she was the chief student of the year in 1902 at this technical college. And she became the first recipient of the Mander Scholarship. So what was the Mander Scholarship? Well, Mander is a very well-known name in Wolverhampton. The family had established a paint company, and the scholarship arose from this individual, Theodore Mander, who had studied science at London and Cambridge universities, and in 1899 was elected mayor of Wolverhampton. Sadly, he died in 1900, but undoubtedly his citizens and the population he was a very much loved person and appreciated person, and they funded a special scholarship called the Mander Scholarship. And this was for someone to enable them to go and study science, commerce, or both at the University of Birmingham for a 2 to 3 year period. They had to be a citizen of Wolverhampton, but the money, the finance, was to enable them to go to the University of Birmingham. And this is what Evelyn had been awarded in 1902. So she duly went to Birmingham University, studied quite a broad range of subjects. Sadly, the archives, there was some missing archives that had been destroyed. I'm not sure whether it was a flood or a fire, something like that. So the records of her final year are missing, and I don't know what she did, but I suspect it was chemistry, because she then graduated in 1905, one of only 2 women who graduated in chemistry. She stayed on a further year, and although her MSc has not been able to be found, it was undoubtedly, I think, on the topics which then she published. Her first publications were in 1907 and then in 1909 with Alexander Findlay, who was a physical chemist, a lecturer at the University of Birmingham. So she was already making her way in the field of chemistry as early as 1907. Between 1906, when she left Birmingham University, and 1910, I really don't know what happened, other than that I think it's highly likely that she probably went home. Academic chemistry, as we've in other talks, was not a subject that was seen fit for women in those days, and I suspect the opportunities were minimal, if at all. So my guess is that she probably went back home and helped the family. in 1911, family moved from this quite idyllic environment in Codsall back to Wolverhampton, or to Wolverhampton. Wilfred, her younger brother, had become a milk steriliser in the family business. Florence, cookery teacher, and Alice was doing domestic duties. Evelyn, now having got her chemistry qualifications, was now 29 and became a student at King's College for Women in London. Went down to London to do a diploma in science and economics. I think this was thought to be a more fitting qualification and career for a woman with a chemistry degree. Now, we're now going to just whip over to across the Atlantic to Canada, because the domestic science movement was also taking off in Canada. And there was a link between Canada, Toronto to be precise, and King's College London. Toronto University had founded this prestigious department of household science with this building, the Lillian Massey building. This lady, Annie Laird, was the founding principal of household science department. And it would appear from a few little comments that I've unearthed that there was someone at King's College London who was from Toronto and asked Evelyn if she would go and work in Toronto and provide input into the household science department by means of her chemistry knowledge. So they were trying to bolster the household science with some chemistry. So she was formally invited to Toronto, and I've just copied here a couple of statements, a couple of bullet points from the history of the household science department at Toronto. It was first of all preparing students to shop, cook and serve the day's meals. But it then expanded from the traditional woman's role, in quotes, by teaching students the science behind the housework and teaching them to perform lab research in food chemistry. And this is obviously where Evelyn came in, because here she was, having got qualifications in chemistry, coming to provide that aspect of the work. So they were clearly very keen to get her on board, but unfortunately World War I intervened. Now, it would appear that Evelyn had got some form of a position in London around this time, around 1917, and she resigned this position to take up the post at London University. But she couldn't get a passport, and things dragged on. So she then took a post in Gloucester. So here she was travelling all over the country, basically, to get employment as a science lecturer at the School of Cookery. The travel and passport problems continued into 1918 and in fact got to the high level of the Under Secretary of State for External Affairs in Ottawa and the President of Toronto University. And I unearthed some correspondence in the archives, which I just put a couple of quotes there in red about the regulations affecting the travel of women from England are entirely a matter in the hands of the British authorities. Rather dismissive, but then everything possible will be done in a passage for her on a convoyed vessel. So this was correspondence specifically about Evelyn, and great efforts were made to get her a passport, which duly happened sometime during, I presume, at the end of the war, 1918, at the end of 1918. So she went on a ship from Liverpool to Quebec in the middle of the winter in 1919. This is a copy of the manifest of the ship that she went on, the Minidosa, which left from Liverpool, and a picture of the Minidosa. This is a manifest here showing Evelyn's name and the fact that she was a teacher. I've found from the archives in Toronto a couple of calendars, as they call them, of the Faculty of Household Science. Small faculty of 6 individuals here in 1921. She was appointed lecturer in the summer of 1919. And if you won't be able to read these, I realise that, but I just put it on so I can remind myself that listed here are these various courses within the department, and there was an advanced laboratory course with special diets, and this was undoubtedly where Evelyn's role took off in terms of the chemistry. And then here again in 2022 she's listed in the faculty. I think there's an extra 2 members of staff by this stage. Photograph I have got is this one here, which is from Toronto, and maybe Evelyn took the photograph, but I suspect is a photograph of a graduation ceremony, the new graduates, all ladies here, apart from the gentleman with this rather impressive looking mace here. But all the ladies are carrying these huge bouquet of flowers, which rather made me smile. Presumably this was their graduation. So Evelyn was there, and I suspect would have stayed, I don't know, for the duration of her career, who knows. But in before I go on, 2 photographs from the household science department, the cooking laboratory, which does look a bit like a laboratory, I think, and a gymnasium, which again made me smile. Anyway, in 1922, unfortunately, Evelyn's mother in Wolverhampton became ill, and Evelyn came home back, this time from Montreal to Liverpool, this time on the Montrose. Again, here she is in the manifest, Evelyn Hickmans as a teacher. And she came back to Wolverhampton, where her mother was ill, and her mother subsequently died. And she never, apart from going back for, I think she went back a couple of times for a trip. She was invited to go back, in fact, to Toronto, but she didn't go back. She stayed here in the UK and went on to do even more significant work, which I'm now going to come on to. So having got this chemistry background, this chemistry background, having been working in household science and contributing the chemistry to the course, she had also learned a huge amount about nutrition and dietetics. She had become a friend of Annie Laird, the professor in Toronto, and she had spent a lot of her personal time learning more about nutrition and dietetics. And it was this that would eventually become very important in the most significant amount of her work, which I'm going to come on to. So the next phase of her work, having come back to Wolverhampton, it wasn't long before she was asked by this gentleman here, who was the professor of paediatrics at Birmingham Children's Hospital, Parsons, to come to the hospital and set up a chemistry laboratory. Leonard Parsons was well known for his research. He was studying in particular children and infants who were malnourished. It was a major issue at this time in the 1920s. And Evelyn was asked if she would go and set up a chemistry laboratory. He wanted to have chemical analyses to support his research. Now, how did he know about Evelyn? You might well ask. Well, it was his cousin. And so he asked her to go and work at the hospital without pay and set up the very first paediatric chemistry lab, probably in the world. Now, I just want to digress here and say a little bit about clinical chemistry. Obviously, it's the application of chemistry to human disease. So here we are in 1923. What was known about clinical chemistry, more being done using urine than anything else, in fact, because it was easier to get hold of than blood. So simple work, measuring volume, smell, specific gravity, colour, and even taste. Certain individual medical doctors were wanting to investigate particular areas of medicine, so work had gone on with looking at the composition of renal stones, and some work looking at the acidity of gastric juice, but very limited. The first and the early hospital labs were predominantly for microbiology. But with the advent of, in particular, the blood glucose method being published in 1920, the need and the desirability to start measuring chemicals in chemical constituents in blood became important. And the first hospital biochemist was actually appointed in 1921 in the UK. And this also was in Birmingham, but not at the Children's Hospital, at the Dudley Road Hospital. Paediatric clinical chemistry has the added challenge of small subjects. And Evelyn was the second biochemist to be appointed in the country, the first in the Children's Hospital. And she was given a small side room, virtually with nothing, and in her own words said she was given a few beakers and a rack of dirty test tubes. And she was the doctor's assistant, asking him what tests did he want set up. She herself said there was very little to know about clinical chemistry in those days. So she knew nothing, but what was there to know? So she had single-handedly set up the department at Birmingham Children's Hospital in 1923. And she soon got on with some huge pieces of work. The first one was a study of Dr. Parsons' malnourished infants. And she studied 48 infants, measuring 24-hour fecal samples and urine samples over 8 days in each infant. This is a huge piece of work, and the mind boggles really as to how she collected all those samples and how she was the sheer logistics of it, storage of them, let alone the analyses. And she had set up calcium and fat analysis as her first two tests in 1923, and she applied those to feces and urine and also to the analysis of milks. So she was able to look at the relationship between the intake of calcium and fat from different milks absorbed to see how this affected malnutrition. The work was a huge piece, and she published in 1924, which again I think is staggering. In 1923, based on this work, she was awarded a second MSc from Birmingham University. She was awarded a PhD in 1925. And from then onwards, she was obtaining MRC grants in her own right as an assistant to the work of Dr. Parsons, but she was obtaining funding for her own salary and subsequently for salaries for other chemists. And she was mainly working on wasting disorders and nutrition, setting up small sample analysis, microanalysis for the chemicals. As I said, starting off with fat and calcium, but soon progressing to others such as nitrogen, phosphorus, protein, and she went on to do a lot more. So the place was expanding quite rapidly, and she was given 2 rooms in 1925, so she expanded and started to get some staff. She was now working not just with Dr. Parsons, but with other paediatricians in the hospital, and she became the hospital biochemist. She was working now on a diverse range of clinical problems. She was expanding the test repertoire, and she developed and undertook studies to look at and find out reference data for different ages of infants and children. This is a concept that now we all take for granted, that, you know, as we say in the profession, children are not just small adults. Children of different ages have different levels of chemical constituents compared to adults. Babies even more different levels, and preterm infants even more. And she was already thinking about this in the mid 1920s, which is incredible. She was given a new, larger lab. They built a laboratory over the new outpatient department in 1932, and she was getting additional staff. This is a picture. This is Evelyn here. This is beginning to look a little bit more like a laboratory. But the famous tea room was always in the laboratory. I mean, even I remember the tea rooms going well into the early 70s. Tea was being made in the laboratory. Horror of horrors now. But she went on to study a whole host of different disorders. And I'm just going to show you some title pages, really, of some of her publications, which were enormous in number. Just to give you a flavour of the diversity of the subject matter that she studied and the type of work that she was doing. She was studying individual patients now with different doctors. This is Dr. Braid here. A rare disorder, alkaptonuria, one of the first disorders to be described that was found to be inherited in nature. So this was the beginning of the study of inherited diseases. Then we have further work here on measurement of components in response to aspirin or salicylate treatment. So looking at the effect of treatment on different chemical components. Another inherited disorders here, cystinuria, one of the also early disorders which was known to be inherited. And again, a different doctor here, but studying the family history, the genetics, and the different quantities of cysteine in body fluids in this condition. Now, two interesting little anecdotes here. One is about vitamin C. As some of you will know, I suspect, that vitamin C was first synthesized in Birmingham in the chemistry department at the University of Birmingham. And Evelyn was the first person to obtain this synthetic vitamin C for use in her work to give to children, to treat children. And so this is one of the early pieces of work, probably the earliest piece of work, looking at vitamin C excretion in children. This is this particular one in reference to rheumatic fever. Another little interesting anecdote, which I don't have a paper on, was the fact that Evelyn had a colony of rats in the department. And one of the studies that she did, which she describes in an interview she did, was to take the rats to different parts of Birmingham and leave them in their cages, I hasten to add, in the gardens of the various doctors who live in the city. And she discovered that those rats who went to the north part of the city, which was a lot more industrialized, developed rickets, whereas those that went to the leafy, nice green suburbs much further south of the city centre with more sunlight didn't develop rickets. So I thought that was an interesting little anecdote that she talked about. Her work, she continued to work and made headlines in the local newspaper. This is a little cutting that I found in her papers that she had left from probably the Birmingham Mail or Post in 1937. And it was showing that the headlines were, if you look a bit further down here, in defence of bridge teas and press ball fashions. So this was a weekly column of a woman's log in the local paper. But the headline this week was Women Scientists at Birmingham Children's Hospital. And it's really a little report of 3 biochemists, including Evelyn, who were all from Wolverhampton, interestingly, all of whom had graduated at Birmingham University, and we're now all working at the Children's Hospital undertaking research. So she was clearly attracting other people to come and work in her laboratory who'd also got chemistry qualifications. Now, World War II was on the horizon, and she didn't stop working at the hospital during that time, and she in fact continued to publish. Oh gosh, the thing seems to, hang on, I'll just go out and just see if it will go back in. Yeah, okay. During the war, she still continued to publish. So here we have a couple of papers on pigments, which were published in 1941. I'm showing these not so you can see the detail, but just I hope you can begin to get the impression that this was somebody who was really doing a huge amount of work of great across a huge spectrum of biochemistry. And in 1943, she published a piece of work, which today, I mean, you couldn't contemplate, I don't think, studying 180 infants from birth to 40 weeks, including 20 premature infants. Trying to get ethical commission would be huge. She had got microanalysis, only requiring 10 microliters of plasma, which even today is considered small. And she was doing a study comparing the levels in these infants of different ages. Here we have the age across the bottom of this graph, against the plasma protein level, showing that it did change with age compared to the adults, which you'll see in this right-hand column here. And the prem infants had even lower values. So this was one of the very first studies, way ahead of its time, studying the different reference or finding reference data for different ages. By now, Evelyn was nearing retirement. She was nearing 70 years of age. I know I've speeded through this a bit, but I wanted to leave a bit of time at the end here just to talk about her most significant achievement, which was right at the end of her career. She had begun to form networks in the Midlands and had also developed networks across the country and in fact overseas. She became the founder and the first president of the University Federation of University Women in Wolverhampton, and she was instrumental in the formation of the West Midlands Association of Clinical Biochemists. She became a focus for teaching and training, and she had visitors from all over the world. and she was setting up new investigations. Still at the age of 70, about to retire. And I just mentioned this one because this was the most significant piece of work that she did. And this was amino acids. This is a two-dimensional chromatogram of, in this case, it was pure amino acids, but she was investigating urine and plasma. It took 2 overnight runs of the solvents, so it took 3 days to do a single chromatogram from a particular patient. So a huge amount of work. And at that time, she had 2 colleagues who she collaborated with. And again, the 3 of them together brought about this great achievement, which is a world's first. John Gerard was a paediatrician at the hospital, and he had an outpatient clinic for children with mental retardation, as it was called in those days. We call it learning disabilities today. And Horst Bickel, who was a PhD student who had come from Germany in 1949, and he had come in order to study amino acids. And he was doing his PhD at the University of Birmingham, studying in Evelyn's laboratory. Now, the work concerned an individual patient called Sheila Jones, who was a 2-year-old little girl. Sheila's mother was worried about Sheila because she wasn't doing the normal things that a little girl should do. And so she was taken to the family doctor, and he referred her to this Dr. Gerard's clinic at Birmingham Children's Hospital. They diagnosed this rare disorder, phenylketonuria, or PKU, and it was the very first case that they had diagnosed in the hospital. The disorder had first been described in 1934. These are some still pictures taken from a video of Sheila, just showing her to be a very unhappy, miserable little 2-year-old, unable to stand. PKU is due to a deficiency of this enzyme system here in the liver, the phenylalanine hydroxylase system, causing a buildup of phenylalanine in the body fluids, in particular in the blood. And it was thought that the phenylalanine and its byproducts, in particular phenylpyruvic acid that spills over into the urine, are the cause of the inadequate brain development and the mental retardation that ensues. Now, what did they know about PKU at the time? Well, very little. Individuals were normal at birth. They had these characteristic features of severe mental deficiency and no speech. They often had epilepsy and eczema, and they had this funny mouse-like smell. It was a very bleak disorder to be diagnosed with. Most cases were institutionalized as mental defectives, as they were called in those days. And it was thought that there was about at least 1,600 cases in the UK in the various asylums, with over 1,000 patients in each asylum. And they were often referred to as feeble-minded. 60% had severe learning disabilities and were referred to, in the terminology of the day, as idiots with IQs less than 20. Now, there was no treatment. The doctors were very excited. This was their first case, but Sheila's mother wanted treatment and pestered and badgered the doctors to find a treatment. And so they set about doing something that had been suggested, but had been thought to be impossible, which was to prepare a special diet, Evelyn Hickmans' help, so that Sheila could be treated with a low phenylalanine diet. And they did this in the autumn of. So just to recap, Sheila's mother really pestered the doctors for treatment. They did what had been thought to be impossible, which was to prepare this phenylalanine-free mixture, which was a disgusting acid-tasting mixture, as the protein for this little girl. So she didn't have any normal protein apart from a small amount of milk to enable enough phenylalanine to enable her to grow. So this became the world's first protein substitute. And Evelyn Hickmans set up tests to measure Sheila's blood levels of phenylalanine, her urine, phenylpyruvic acid levels, tailored the diet so that Sheila was able to grow. And this enabled Sheila to go home after 4 months in hospital with weekly visits to see the doctors and also to collect her diet, which they made every week, week in, week out. It was a huge commitment. So this was Evelyn and Horst Bickel doing this work, and they produced it in a Winchester bottle every week for Mary to take home for Sheila. Sheila improved. These are again stills taken from a video showing Sheila is now able to walk with the aid of a chair, and really the rest is history. This was the first treatment for PKU in the world. They published in 1953, and there are 3 points just quickly to make. That the beneficial effects of a low phenylalanine intake seem unequivocal, that it was important to start treatment early. Sheila was already 2 and she was already brain damaged, and so that affected how much progress she could make. The importance of early testing. And thirdly, by 1953, the manufacturer of casein had already begun to produce phenylalanine-free casein hydrolysis. They had taken on the procedure from Bickel in order to produce something commercially. So this became the first commercial diet for PKU. And just quickly say that newborn screening then followed. So all babies started to be tested for PKU, so the diagnosis could be made in the first week after birth and treatment started. This was all due to the work by Evelyn and her colleagues. By 1968, the whole country in the UK was screening for PKU using this heel prick test, which is still in existence and now has been expanded to 9 different disorders. The legacy is huge. PKU treatment, highly successful. These are 3 young people who have normal lives, successful careers, who've all been screened for PKU at birth and have all been on the diet, the basis of which Evelyn Hickmans devised. In 1962, the 3 doctors received this very prestigious award, the John Scott Award, an award from Philadelphia, previously given to Marie Curie for radium, to Banting for insulin, and to Fleming for penicillin. But you can see the importance of this award. And it was given to Evelyn Hickmans and her colleagues in 1962 at a special ceremony here at the Children's Hospital. Evelyn was now retired, and she had moved to a nice house, which is nice to think she had somewhere nice to live in the northwest side of Wolverhampton. She enjoyed gardening and photography, we understand, but she carried on working. She did lecturing work at Wolverhampton College, where she had started out, and she did a lot of ad hoc lecturing. So she never stopped, and she was really working up until the day she died. What was Evelyn like as a person? Well, because there's no one to speak to from her family, I've just gleaned some information from individuals who met her. Tom Day I met and chatted to. He had been a student with Evelyn, and he described her as a formidable lady who had boys under sufferance in his lab. She clearly preferred women in the laboratory. She was very determined. Her colleagues described her as decisive, stimulating, but she had dignity, charm, and a warm nature. And importantly, for the work she did, she was able to engage with children, and was in fact a very humble individual and never sought recognition, which is why I think she's never really featured in much about the history of chemistry in the clinical arena until now. Her legacy, to sum up, is threefold. Paediatric Clinical Chemistry is now international. Birmingham Children's Hospital now, instead of 30 to 40 tests a day, does 3,500 tests a day for the children in the hospital, has a repertoire of 270 different tests, and does a lot of specialist tests for inherited disorders. The treatment of PKU, which was started by Evelyn, she devised the first diet, has now got worldwide interest. And I think one important factor is that this was the first disorder that caused mental retardation, as it was called, which was treatable. And I think it altered the perspective of mental disorders in those days, that you could have treatable forms of disability. And finally, as I mentioned, newborn screening took off. The laboratory has just celebrated its 100 years of Evelyn. It's now in Whittle Street in Birmingham, if anybody knows Birmingham. All these are the laboratories for the Children's Hospital. This is just a picture of the main chemistry lab. If you go back to the original photo I showed you of Evelyn's lab, not a test tube in sight here, not a beaker in sight. In fact, all the material goes into these huge floor standing instruments which churn out these tests using computer screens. So a very different place. And I just want to sum up Evelyn with two quotes, which I think say a lot about her. Dr. Gerard, in his 1962 speech when they got the John Scott Award, said, Dr. Hickmans is worth 50 of us. He was referring to himself and Dr. Bickle. And Dr. Clifford Parsons, who was the son of Leonard Parsons, her cousin, says what a wonderfully stimulating person she was. And I think this statement here about where clinicians and laboratory scientists can meet and find common ground is so important, and is one that I think any laboratory scientist working in a hospital environment would feel proud of if that was their laboratory. So, in summary, a remarkable lady who did a huge amount, and I think we owe her a significant thanks to what she has done for the study of children's disease. Thank you all for listening. I'm sorry about the little hiccup with the technology. I don't know what happened there, but I hope you've enjoyed it. And just to say thank you and acknowledge individuals and departments that have helped me with the research for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, for such a wonderful talk about a clearly very important woman. We've got a few questions here. I have to say several of them by me. But my first question is Finlay, because she worked initially, as you pointed out, with Alexander Finlay. Now, Alexander Finlay nowadays is probably best known for his work on the popularization of chemistry. Did he have a particularly favourable attitude toward women being in chemistry? Did he promote women in chemistry?
Yeah, I've got no information, unfortunately, about that aspect, I'm afraid. I didn't realise she'd worked with him until I found the publications. There's nothing about her in the chemistry department, sadly, today, which says anything more about what she did, because her MSc was, and I suspect it was on that subject of her publications, has been lost with this damage to the archives at the university. So it's an important bit that's missing, unfortunately.
Yeah. The other thing is the Folin-Wu test. I mean, I must admit, when you first put it up on the screen, I assumed it was an individual called Folin-Wu, but I gather it's actually two people, Mr. Folin.
Yes, it's Mr. Yes. It's a test for blood sugar.
A little bit about it for this audience.
It's basically a test where you measure the reduction capacity of glucose and precipitate it and look at the colour. So it's a photometric test, which was developed in, I think, about 1920, but was applicable to blood, which one of the key issues to do with measurement in blood was the protein, the huge amounts of protein that's in blood. So it was about being able to precipitate protein in order to measure the constituent analytes.
Yes, Alan said in the comment that it was important for the discovery
well, also, yeah, insulin, of course, had been was described in the early 20s. So the treatment of diabetes with insulin, which first started, I think, about 1922 or thereabouts, the blood sugar measurement became a critical part of being able to treat.
Do you know anything about Mr. Foley and Mr. Wu?
I don't know. Oh, sorry,
Okay.
I didn't mean to put that on. It was just if I was asked a question, it was just to say if anybody wants more information about the Sheila Jones story, that's a book that is about that. Yeah. No, I don't know anything about Mr. Foley and Mr. Wu. I will look it up.
Anyway, yeah, I assume, I mean, this is probably a no-brainer, but I assume that PKU is the reason why there's a warning with aspartame.
Yes, aspartame, which was used freely as an artificial sweetener, until it was realised that as a tripeptide, it's got phenylalanine in, and it became a no-no for the diet. So these individuals who start this very low protein diet immediately, they're diagnosed in the first week of life. As they get older, it became a problem with the sugary drinks that became available. So now it's as a warning on all products. It was something the parents group had to campaign for to get on products.
And in fact, it ties in with a question that Alan Drumfield asked. Do children with PKU, are they able to move on to a more normal diet as they get older?
Yes, there's a lot of discussion and it's extremely variable. There is a huge number of different genetic mutations, and it ranges from, being able to have very little protein to quite a substantial amount. It depends on the degree of enzyme deficiency. But generally speaking, they are able to. But when you speak to, in fact, this is what happened when I was working in the field. There used to be this relaxation of diet as they got into their teens, because they don't want to be on it anyway at that age. So it all sort of felt, well, perhaps we can relax the diet. But the individuals themselves began to describe that they weren't feeling quite right. Loss of or lack of concentration, just feeling a bit odd, a bit off. And when some of the individuals who were going on to higher education, particularly at universities, they said, I want to go back on diet because I don't feel as good. So now it's seen as a diet for life. And the other key point is that when the first cohort of women with PKU came through and started to get pregnant, the damage that was done to the developing fetus, if you're not on a very strict diet, was considerable. So individuals were giving birth to babies with severe congenital abnormalities because of the PKU that the mother had. So anyone who wants to have a baby with PKU has to go back on the diet before conception. So the whole message now is diet for life. Yeah. But perhaps I should just say there are some new treatments which I haven't had a chance to talk about. But the newer treatments are that some of the individuals actually, if you remember that slide of the PKU defect, there is a cofactor in there, tetrahydrobiopterin, and some individuals respond to the supply of the biopterin because the defect is not in the protein of the enzyme, but is actually in the cofactor. So there's a huge spectrum of different abnormalities within PKU. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting, very interesting. And we see on the screen here the book you've written about Sheila.
Yes. So there's it's the Sheila Jones story, told from the family perspective. I was fortunate enough to meet Sheila before she died, and I also have managed to meet her family. She had brothers who are still alive in Birmingham, and they've been very helpful in providing information to write what is essentially a family story about Sheila. It's a very sad story because Sheila herself ended up in one of these asylums in Birmingham. She never spoke a word in her life, in spite of having some success, early success with treatment, which was enough to stimulate the world to treat PKU. Yeah.
So what basically it wasn't done in time.
No, she was 2. I mean, the brain develops, and by 2 years, most of it's well developed. You can't reverse it. You can perhaps prevent things getting worse, but she was already significantly damaged. But she showed significant improvement to be able to demonstrate that it was successful.
Okay,
but not for her benefit, possibly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's the case of where she wasn't helped that much, but it helped everybody else afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anne, for a fascinating talk. I mean, a talk about Sheila as much as Evelyn Hickmans. So thank you very much for that. Nick, thank you everybody for coming along as well. Next month, we have Helen Cook, who will be talking about pioneering individuals and publications in chemical information. So her talks about chemical information are always very interesting, and I hope you'll come along next month. Same time, same place. Well, meanwhile, goodbye, everybody, and have a good time for the rest of the afternoon. Bye for now.
Bye.
And meet.